Threat assessment can feel overwhelming in EDH, especially if you're newer to the game and feel like you don't understand most of the cards. However, as someone who has been playing EDH for a long time but does a pretty poor job of staying up to date on what all the latest cards are, I can tell you that knowing what every card does is not necessary for you to perform threat assessment in casual EDH games. Now, just to be clear, that kind of logic does not apply to highly competitive situations. I can't tell you the last time I saw a new card while playing Historic Arena. In fact, usually in the first 1 or 2 turns of the game, I will know almost exactly how my opponent's deck is composed. But in casual Battlecruiser EDH, the card pool is so large it's not really possible to precisely know what your opponents put in their deck, and even if you read every card they play, it can still be difficult to tie everything together and figure out what their game plan is. Thankfully, instead of trying to understand every possible card our opponents are playing, we can instead use the concept of card advantage to develop a basic understanding of which player is the greatest threat to us and how we should move forward with our strategy. Card advantage is most simply defined as a player getting access to the cards they need. Since each card plays a role in getting us closer to our win condition, the more card advantage we have, the more likely we are to be closer to winning the game. The most basic and obvious example of card advantage is card draw. If I cast Harmonize and draw 3 cards, then I've increased my overall card advantage by 2. The reverse is also true. If I cast a spell like Mind Rake and make my opponent discard 2 cards, then I've gone down 1 card but made my opponent go down by 2. Thus, I've developed 1 card advantage relative to my opponent. We would also call this a 2-for-1, because for the cost of 1 card, you've knocked 2 of your opponent's cards out of the game. Unfortunately, if we assume it is a 4-player game, then I, who cast 1 card which ended up in the graveyard, and my opponent who discarded 2 cards in the graveyard, have both lost cards relative to the other 2 opponents. This is an important concept to keep in mind both when deck building and when playing. If you expend 1 card to deal with only one of your opponents, your other 2 opponents gain a relative advantage. These 2 examples demonstrate card advantage in its purest form, but there is a subtype of card advantage called permanent advantage. Permanent advantage is simply how many permanents a player has on the field. If you have 3 cards in play and 2 cards in hand, you have 5 cards total. If your opponent has no cards in hand and 2 cards in play, they have 2 cards total. In this way, we could say you have 3 total card advantage relative to them, and you have 1 permanent advantage relative to them. Just like with card advantage, generally speaking, it's important that you're careful about going down in permanent advantage to deal with 1 player. For example, it makes a lot of sense to use a strip mine to blow up an opponent's Gaia's Cradle or Nyktos Shrine of Nyx, because these 2 lands can generate a huge mana advantage, which allows 1 player to pull way out ahead of everyone else. However, if you choose to do that, your other 2 opponents will develop card, permanent, and mana advantage relative to you. Basically, this is a play that puts you 1 turn behind your other 2 opponents. You may choose to take one for the team and make that play, but keep in mind, the rest of the team is actually hostile to you, and they're more than happy to watch you shoot yourself in the foot while dealing with the bigger threat to them. As an aside, a good way to deal with this situation is make a deal with your opponents. Tell them something like, I'll strip mine the Gaia's Cradle, but you 2 have to agree to not blow up any of my permanents next turn. Now that we've established what card advantage is, as well as related concepts like permanent advantage and mana advantage, we can discuss how to use these concepts to determine who the biggest threat to us is. The most simple formula is to merely count every single card a player has. For example, if player A has 5 cards in hand and 5 cards in play, and player B has 5 cards in play but no cards in hand, we can say that player A is clearly the biggest threat, because they have access to 10 cards, while player B has access to only 5. Of course, the game states are usually not so simple. For example, what if both players have 5 cards in play and 5 cards in hand? Then we need to apply a new concept called card quality. Card quality can apply both to cards in hand as well as permanents in play. For permanents in play, it's fairly simple to understand. For example, if player A has 4 lands and Kozilek Butcher of Truth in play, and player B has 4 lands and Skeleton Ship in play, then clearly the player with Skeleton Ship in play is the biggest threat, and you should immediately strip mine their island to kill their Skeleton Ship and then beast with it. Actually, now that I look a little more closely, maybe Kozilek is the bigger threat, but I'm unsure. What do you think? Leave a comment and let me know. Even if cards are in a player's hand and we don't know what they are, we can still apply the concept of card quality. For example, if I know player A has been using land tax to get basics into their hand for a few turns, it may be they have 7 cards in hand, but most or all are simply basic lands. On the other hand, if player B only has 2 cards in hand, but they recently cast Dig Through Time, which allows them to look at the top 7 cards of their library and put 2 into their hand, it's almost as good as a 7 card hand, since they got to put the best 2 cards out of 7 into their hand. Now, the last factor to consider here is the aforementioned mana advantage. For example, let's imagine player A has 7 cards in hand and 7 lands in play, but the ability to generate 11 mana thanks to Cabal Coffers, and player B has 7 cards in hand and only 7 lands. In this situation, we can say that player A is clearly the bigger threat, because even though the card advantage and permanent advantage are equal, player A has more resources for casting their cards in hand. Because player A has mana advantage, they'll be able to cast either more spells or cast more powerful spells on their turn, which will mean they'll eventually develop relative card and permanent advantage. Of course, this is all just basic threat assessment, but even against my friends' decks that I've played against dozens of times, there's still times I'll fall back on these basic concepts to decide who I'm going to deal with on one of my turns. Also, I want to point out I didn't mention any zones except the hand and battlefield. There are other ways to have card advantage, such as via the command zone or graveyard. E.g., with a partner commander deck, that player is essentially starting with an opening hand of 9 cards, while everyone else starts with an opening hand of 8. And if a player has ways to recur cards from their graveyard, then all it takes is a full graveyard and a single card like Eternal Witness for a player to grab one super high quality card into their hand and then cast it to turn the game around in their favor. Keep in mind, these concepts are just about the entire game of Magic the Gathering, and as such are very complex topics that you should basically always be thinking about. When you build a deck or mulligan a hand, you should be asking yourself things like, how will I develop card and mana advantage? If you're playing black, will you choose to trade one resource, your life total, to develop card advantage? When you go to blow up a permanent with Beast Within, are you going to blow up the Gaia's Cradle that gives a player a huge mana advantage? Or are you going to blow up a Consecrated Sphinx, which gives them a huge card advantage? If you cast Swords to Plowshares on a player's commander, are you okay with that reducing your card advantage by 1, since their commander simply goes back to the command zone where they can cast it again? If you're okay with that play, why? Is it because they're playing the Dragon and they're out of cards? So you know if you blow it up, you cut off their card draw, and therefore they'll likely never draw enough lands to cast him again? What if the commander is Yoshimaru, and you know your opponent can easily replay him multiple times? If you plan to cast your single target removal spell against him over and over again, what's your plan to deal with the card disadvantage that you're creating for yourself? Even in combat, you need to be thinking, how am I going to make this combat be a trade in my favor? Will I trade some of my creatures for some of my opponent's life total? Will I trade 2 of my low quality creatures for one of their high quality creatures? These are not easy questions to answer, but if you start asking them, then that's half the battle.